topic for discussion is accelerating the achievement of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. And this discussion as is a pre-CSW activity, because we know that CSW is going to happen next month, and most women around the world will gather in New York to discuss issues that will accelerate the progress of achieving gender equality. And why they're there, most of us will not be able to attend this event, but how are we going to lend our voices to these discussions that will be happening? That's the reason why we're having this discussion today. And we have amazing women that have been pushing to ensure that we have gender equality, that women are represented in all spheres of life. So I won't delve much into this topic because I know they are going to do justice to that. So we just have to relax and give them that opportunity to have this conversation with us. So a time will come where we introduce them. So this is the agenda we have today. Like I earlier said, our moderator will join us shortly while I hold on for her. So the first item we have on the agenda is to introduce our speakers. And I wish Michi was here to do that, but since it's not here, I will just have to do that myself. So you just give me a moment, a brief moment to do this. Okay, so this is a moderator, but I will just introduce her so that when she comes, she'll just take over from me. So Michi, as we fondly call her, is an African feminist passionate about fighting structural and intersecting inequalities while contributing to the fairer, more just, equal, and sustainable world. Over the last 15 years, she has worked with women's rights organizations, civil societies, and government in developing strategies, building partnerships, managing programs, and engaging communities towards the promotion and protection of women's rights and the health of the planet. So she is a senior global policy lead at WIDO. So Mishi, we can't wait to meet you. So first speaker is Sasha. Sasha is the executive director of WEP International. WEP is a major international network of women and environment organizations working for sustainable development and gender equality in over 50 countries and contributing to international policy processes. Sasha has been key in the creation of the Women's Major Group at the UN, ensuring participation of over 1,000 women's organizations in the Sustainable Development Goals, policy processes, and is actively engaged with the women gender constituencies at the climate change negotiation. And surprisingly, is in Kenya right now engaging at UNIA, but because of the passion she has for women issues, she has accepted to join us on this discussion. Thank you, Sasha. We can't wait to have you discuss with us. Next speaker is Hawa Mustafa. She is a social justice advocate, researcher, and a policy analyst specializing in gender, poverty, climate change, labor, and employment. With over 2 decades of experience, she has contributed to various initiatives, including Vision 2020 and Nigeria's nationally determined contribution Currently, she's pursuing a PhD in development studies. She serves on multiple NGO boards and holds leadership positions advocating for African women's rights and development. She is a feminist, author, and dedicated development activist. Thank you, man. Thank you for accepting to be with us on development series today. And we are waiting to have you join us in this discussion. So that's the lineup of speakers that we have for development series today. And next on the agenda is opening remark from Dr. Priscilla Ashakba, who is the founder and global lead of Women Environmental Program. Man, thank you for joining us, and you have a floor for your remarks. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone.
Morning. We can hear you.
Good morning, ma'am.
Yeah, good morning,
Good
ma.
morning.
Good morning, ma.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm so delighted to be here today, particularly the fact
Morning,
that I
ma.
have, good morning, particularly that I have some wonderful speakers, my dearest sisters. You have Sasha, you have Mishi, you have Hawa. Those are people that when it comes to the issues of gender, you cannot take for granted. And I just want to say thank you very much for agreeing to be with us and to join us in this. As you know, every year we have all over the world women converging the space in New York to discuss the status of women. And of course, this is something that should worry most of us because we have been discussing what actions have we been taking. You see what is happening around the world. In Nigeria today, we have a lot of conflict, and most of the people that are affected are women and children. How do we address those issues? How do we take it up? And these are some of the things that most of us and my colleagues that are here on this call, we have been fighting over the years, and some of us have made tremendous progress, especially at the climate space, but at the CSW, we also need to be there. My own is just to welcome you. Damalis has already kind of set the setting. And so just to say thank you for each and every one of you for being with us here. And I crave your indulgence to listen to these wonderful speakers that we have, my dearest friends who are going to be speaking to us and providing insights. So I don't want to preempt them. The knowledge they have, I don't really have that much, but I know that they're very versatile. So just to say thank you once. Hello, over.
Hello.
Okay, thank you so much, man. Thank you for that remark. Please, I will beg of you to mute your mic when you don't have the floor. And if you want to make any contribution, a time will come where you'll be asked to do so, and you will raise your hand and the floor will be given to you. And for introduction of participants that have joined us, please do that in the chat box. This is also an avenue for us to connect and network. So you just tell us your name, where you're joining us from, your organization, and possibly if you want to drop your contact for people to reach out to you, that will be fine. But do that via the chat box. So the next on our agenda, we're going to have a presentation from our speaker, Sasha. She'll give us a background of the topic that we're discussing today to set the discussion on and make it very interactive. So Sasha, over to you. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good morning to Nigeria and to many other countries. Burkina Faso, I see our colleagues. And so I don't know where everybody is from. I'm currently in Nairobi, Kenya, for a UN conference on environment. And my name is Sasha Gabizon. I'm the International Director of Women Engaged for a Common Future. I am a proud, born in Nigerian feminist. Born in Nigeria, feminist, but I'm currently based in the Netherlands and in Germany, where we have our offices. So thank you very much, Women Environmental Program, Priscilla Chakpa and colleagues for inviting me to speak to you today. Like Priscilla, I have been engaged for a long time in women's struggle for women's rights and also for women's decision-making on sustainable development. And so this year we are also preparing to go to New York to the UN Commission on the Status of Women, where we will be looking specifically at how to eliminate poverty through strengthening women's rights. We know that women are the ones which invest most in their communities, which are the main food providers for their communities, but who are continuously discriminated in many countries through laws and practices. And with WEP and with other partner organizations like we do, we have been engaged already since many years, really since the Third World Women's Conference in Nairobi and since the Fourth World Women's Conference in Beijing, where we created the Beijing Action Platform, a platform for action with its super important action points, including on women and environment. And of course, we have been engaged and we have been given a space in the United Nations processes to speak on behalf of the civil society, women and feminist organizations globally in now all the processes which deal with development. So we have a seat in the climate negotiations. We have a seat in the Sustainable Development Goals negotiations and its high-level political panel. And there, and here in Nairobi, we also have a seat in the environmental global governance and decision-making. And there are many grassroots and rural women here with us. And that has been, I think, one of the great achievements of us feminist organizations, that we have obtained that space where we can have our voices heard and where we can influence decisions of our governments and at the global level. And yeah, so we will be talking today also specifically about rural women. I know in the panel we'll address some of these questions and good practices. And I wanted to remind us that in 2012, when we agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 agenda for all countries, where all countries committed to, including Nigeria and Kenya and Burkina Faso, that it has very important targets which governments committed to. The targets in SDG 1 to end poverty specifically also addresses women and girls. The target 2 on ensuring that there is no hunger specifically addresses the challenges of rural women and their lack often of land tenure rights. I mean, even though most of the farming especially in Africa, is still done by women, women have much greater access, greater difficulty in accessing finance, having bank accounts, getting funding for their businesses. And so the Sustainable Development Goals aim to change that. And we have, of course, at the core of the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 5 on women's rights and girls' rights and their empowerment. And also here, we have specific aims to strengthen women's rights to, for example, land tenure, which are like a basis to then address other women's rights and empowerment issues. Of course, we also have SDG 3 on health. And in SDG 3 and in SDG 5, we have targets to ensure that women can decide themselves on their bodily autonomy. Data shows that women in rural areas have much more difficulty having access to contraceptives, for example, and to freely decide on their family planning and their sexuality. So all of these targets are already committed to by our governments. And now it's our role to keep the pressure on our governments and make sure that we improve our legislation and our practices. And for example, also on SDG 6, which is on ensuring access to water and sanitation, there are specific targets because we know that women are particularly impacted by a lack of access to water and sanitation. Many of the managers of water in our community are women, but also girls in schools are often facing huge problems with menstrual health and dignity. They lack toilets, they lack places where they can clean themselves and change themselves. They lack access to menstrual products. All these issues are already committed to by our governments to improve. What we need now is to really strengthen our laws and practices and legislation in these areas. And so, yeah, I think that's the interesting work which we have been working on together also with WEP and with many of the other feminist and women's rights organizations that are working together in these global and national spaces for sustainable development. And we try really to address and change the laws. And we also build on what we have. For example, the Convention on Ending Discrimination Against All Women, the CEDAW. CEDAW is more than 50 years old. It's the convention which has been most ratified by all countries in the world, except 2, the USA and North Korea. But the CEDAW is the basis for a lot of legislation in our countries on gender equality and women's rights. So in our discussions later in the panel, we can look at more concrete examples of how we have improved legislation or how we have improved practices, and specifically also to strengthen the empowerment of rural women. And yeah, I don't know how much time I have, but if you're interested in the history of this struggle, which has been led by feminist and women's rights movement for decades, I can also share 2 slides. So let me know if you would like me to do that.
Please go ahead.
Yes? Shall I do so?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, sure.
All right. So I can share. I did this for the government of Romania, so it still has something about Romania in it, but that's okay. So yeah, I think you can see my PowerPoint now. I'll just put it in presentation mode. Can you see anything at all, or is it black? Now, maybe.
You can see.
Yes.
You can see.
Okay. So
yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to show that this is already a struggle which has been going on since before I was born, and that is a long time ago. You know, that we have brought the struggle to the global community. And through the global community, we have been able to create spaces for women's organizations from civil society to engage. First, already the creation of the UN fund for population. So that was really also about family planning and bodily autonomy and women's rights to family planning and sexuality to choose for themselves and decide for themselves. That was in the 1960s. In 1972, there was the big conference on the humans and the environment in Stockholm. And this is where we had the first time civil society organizations engaged, including women's organizations. And we had for the first time a head of state who was a woman in that conference. from India. But of course, we have had since then the creation of what was first UNIFEM and now UN Women. And we had this amazing Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in 1979. Yeah? We've had the series of UN World Conferences of Women. We've had the very important conference on environmental governments in the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit. That was the first time that the women feminist organization were given a seat next to other civil society representatives, such as the NGOs or the farmers, but also the indigenous peoples. We were given seats to be there in the negotiations so that governments would no longer decide about us, about our livelihoods, about our bodies, without us taking part in these negotiations. And then, of course, in 1994, we had the International Conference on Population and Development. That has been essential to strengthen sexual and reproductive health and rights. And right after that, we had the fourth World Conference for Women in Beijing, which still gives us one of the most important action agendas, and where, you know, it was clear that all governments could no longer ignore to advance legislation for gender equality and for women's rights. So let me see if I can show you my second slide. How does that work? Maybe here. Yeah. But that all of that was before the turn of the century. So how come that we still don't have equal rights? How come we still don't have gender equality? Well, therefore, we needed more concrete actions also in the area of, for example, gender budgeting. So we see that with the Millennium Development Goals, where we again had as one of the key goals out of 6, a goal on women's gender equality and empowerment of women, we see that the issue becomes more and more about what do we need to do in our institutions, not only in our laws, but also in our institutions. For example, why do rural women often get bypassed when there are supports, financial supports for agriculture? Why does most of the money go to men in the rural areas? How do we apply gender budgeting to the way we allocate funds in our communities and to priorities? And do we understand what are the priorities for women, and are they getting sufficiently funded? So these areas of really practical implementation of legislation into institutions and how they use their funding, that has been one of the key areas which we see developed in this century. And this is also strengthened with the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. And in addition to the Sustainable Development Goals, we have the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. And the Addis Ababa Action Agenda very much focuses on that equality in funding. So the rest is not interesting. That's what I did for the Romanian government, who is also struggling with similar issues. But yeah, this was sort of an introduction, and I will pass now back the floor to the colleagues from WEP. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I would like to hand over to our moderator because she has joined us. Mishi, you're welcome. I had earlier introduced you before, but you can just turn on your camera so that colleagues can meet you. You're welcome. We are on the presentation. Next on the agenda will be the panel discussion. So you will take over from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you can see me, can hear me okay. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Sasha, for a very detailed presentation. Apologies for joining a little bit late due to unavoidable circumstances. So I would like now to just transition us to another sort of like 10, 15 minutes of panel discussion. And this is really to bring back Sasha, but also Hawa, to now have a conversation with them, especially when now taking this sort of like setting the scene, which Sasha is beautifully set to now sort of like a practical guidance and practical question reflecting in terms of practicalities when it comes to this topic of this year. So allow me to introduce, I'm sure all of you know Sasha, and she has been speaking. Sasha is one of the comrade sister who lead work with WEP International, and she really has been a powerhouse in creating space, especially in the global platform when it comes to Women Major Group, WGC, and many other global spaces to advance gender equality. So welcome, Sasha, to the panel again. And then allow me to introduce Hawa Mustafa. She's a social justice advocate, a researcher, a political analyst, who is specialized in gender poverty, climate change, labor, and employment. And she has more than 2 decades of experience in various, and she has contributed in various initiatives, including specifically to Nigeria, in terms of setting Vision 2020, but also she has contributed to Nigeria NDC, and she's now currently pursuing a PhD. So with that, I don't know if my panel, all of you are on your camera. I can see Sasha. I'm not sure if I can see Howard. Hi, Sasha. Is Howard around?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here. Hello.
All righty. So I would really like to.
Hello.
Awesome. So we have 2 panelists, and I love panels when we have few panelists because you really create time for quality engagement. So Hawa will reflect mostly on Nigeria experience, while Sasha will do like a global perspective on it. So given we have already had sort of like the background setting from Sasha, I would like to start with Hawa. And my first question to you, Hawa, is if you could reflect on key achievements towards gender equality, empowerment of women in Nigeria, what has been done so far. We have seen the journey that Sasha has set for us when it comes to what has been achieved at the global level, and we'll be really keen to hear like specificity of what has happened in Nigeria and what has been achieved towards gender equality, empowerment of women and girls in Nigeria.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Good morning, everybody, and afternoon where you are. Good afternoon. Thanks for that, for this very important opportunity. I'll just, to go into your question, I'll just give a very short background about the situation in Nigeria with respect to gender equality, kind of situational analysis. And this is to say that, first of all, Nigeria is, globally is lagging behind, from the bottom on gender equality. And most of the issues around gender equality in Nigeria is spread across economic, status, is spread across location, and but then it is also differentiated by location and economic status as well as education status. So as we go into the discussion, we'll get to see that for women and girls, it's differentiated, and therefore women and girls in rural and urban areas, it is also differentiated. And even for women and girls in particular location, whether in the urban area or in the rural area, it is also differentiated because there are different ways around which culture and the religion affects the different age groups. And so gender also a factor, operates differently or shows a different experience for people, women and girls at different locations and in different age groups. So having said that, what has been achieved in Nigeria so far? Knowing that Nigeria is one of the bottom, in terms of gender inequality, and it cuts across political space, economic space, cultural space. It cuts across both the public and the private spheres of life. I think one of the major things around achievements is that there is more visibility, in terms of the discourse on gender equality. There is more voice that is being heard in terms of gender inequality. And then once upon a time, it was discourse on gender equality was more or less like an academic discussion. It was more or less like a feminist, discussion, and with all the tags around feminism. But today, even those who may decide not to tag themselves as feminists, understand gender equality and engage the issues of gender equality. So I think one of the most important things is the visibility, the voice, the knowledge, the familiarity or the popularity of the discussion on gender equality that has taken even beyond culture and has also gone into the official circle. Having said that, and I think following from that is the fact that Nigeria was able or has been able to develop a gender policy, a national gender policy from the Federal Ministry of Women Affairs, and that there's some kind of consistency, relatively in reviewing that policy document. And that even beyond that, there has also been some other specific gender policies. For instance, in fact, WEP was very, very instrumental to the development of a climate gender policy for Nigeria. So from talking about gender issues, gender inequality, from just an academic area issue, from just maybe a kind of feminist or activist discussion, it has now deepened, or it has now gone into official circles to the extent that our official documents and policy processes are now deliberately including gender in the formation and in the implementation of the policies. There's also the fact that even the electoral body, 2023, which was last year, about a year ago, Nigeria went into election, and there was a lot of hype, there was a lot of engagement about the process, particularly the electoral body, to include gender clause in its policy and the processes of the electoral process. And this was done. So the electoral body towards 2023 election included gender policy or gender issues into the electoral process. And the whole idea was to ensure that issues of security, issues of voting rights, issues of visibility for women, issues of general political and electoral participation for women were at least properly, handled, and that as much as possible, obstacles or obstructions and challenges in that regard was at least to a large extent, engaged with. Whether this was successful or the extent to which it was successful is a different matter. But for us, the most important success story here is the fact that at least there is an official recognition about the need, to include gender equality in the process of election. And then, so that is it. And I think this extent, to a large extent, will say that some of the success in terms of achievement is the fact that in the question of the electoral process and political participation, is that for the first time, in many years, the number of women that came out to contest for political positions was much higher than we had seen in previous years. However, in spite of the fact that the number of women that came out to participate, I think this time we had about 200 and almost 300 women that came to participate for various electoral positions for both the Senate and the House of Representatives. But unfortunately, the number of women that won the election is much fewer, and if you talked about the ratio compared to the number of women that came out to participate. So you have just 3 women that contested, and 3 women out of over about 188 women that contested for the House of Senate. Only 3 women won out of about 240 women, or about almost 250 women that contested for various seats in the House of Assembly. Only 18 women won across the country. There are also very many women that contested for even presidency across various political parties. There were also those that contested even for primaries, including some of in some of the major political parties. So to that extent, you know, the increase in the voices and the visibility of women and the discussion, the general discussion of gender equality has, you know, permeated both political practices, political discourse, and processes of policy implementation. And I think the other thing around gender, what we have achieved, is the fact that because there has been this permeation, or you know, that the governments or the policy makers have been forced, you know, to accept the reality of gender inclusion and coming from gender inequality. There has also been a deliberate attempt by the government, you know, oftentimes to talk about women's inclusion in policy processes. One particular one of note is that post-COVID, we all know that the economy became very poor, very weak after COVID, but that post-COVID, in terms of some of the palliatives that were being offered post-COVID, there was a deliberate and specialized program, you know, to empower women economically, particularly women in the agriculture sector. So there was the cash, for instance, the cash, the cash, what do I call that? The cash policy, you know, that was introduced for particularly to ameliorate poverty of mostly for the rural women and then for the poor people. There was a special one carved out, a special percentage carved out for women. And there had also been a deliberate policy just before the COVID-19, mostly facilitated or enhanced post-COVID-19, was also the program that sought to assist women in agriculture and women in micro and small businesses. This policy has been deliberate, and to a large extent, this policy has been claimed to be quite successful. So as of achievement, we can see achievement across political scene, across the economic scene, and then I think also culturally, there's also a lot of improvement, because once there is that visibility, now we have more women in education. There are more women that are going to school, both from primary school to university level, and because of the performance of women, particularly in these areas, we are also seeing more women in the labor market that are working and doing the things that once upon a time they will say that it was just made for men alone. So today we find women in different walks of life, engineering, medicine, and so on and so forth. More and more number of women are studying those courses that before now were said to be male-dominated courses. Even if they are still male-dominated courses, you still find a lot of women going into these spaces. So these are the areas in which I'll look at the achievements so far.
Thank you so much, Hawa. No worries at all. That was really, really important, because often than not, we look at ourselves and our struggles and we feel that we haven't achieved anything. So it's really important to spend time on what has been achieved so far and what more that needs to be done. So I just want to reconnect back before I move to Sasha. Specifically now nailing down to the topic of this year, which is addressing issues around poverty. And you did briefly mention that there is, women are not a homogeneous group. There is differences, for example, between rural women and urban women. You have extensively shared examples on how legislation helped. But I want to learn from you and share your experiences in terms of these differences between rural women, we know colleagues, especially women who are living in rural area, they are more impacted, or the majority of them still living in, in absolute poverty. Do we have specific strategies that we have proven to be effective in reaching out and supporting them? So if you can speak for like a minute or so on this distinction and how are we reaching out to this specific group, that would be really helpful. Can you hear me, Hawa?
Yeah, am I coming through? Am I the one you're calling? Is it Sasha or me?
It is you.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, thank you very much. For the rural women, I think the major issues around gender discrimination for the rural women is that of access to basic social infrastructure, which is usually taken for granted. You know, women in the urban areas seem to have more access to education facilities, more access to health facilities, more access to even communication facilities like the internet we're using now and so on and so forth, which also has a way of empowering women, you know, economically and politically, unlike the women in the rural areas that have less access to this. And then for the other thing again is in terms of having access to even tools of empowerment. Again, tools of empowerment usually that come from either government intervention, civil society intervention, and also things that you can also relate with, you know, from social media and the hardcore media. The rural women have less advantage because there are less opportunity. You know, they have less access to these facilities, unlike the urban women. But one common thing that runs a common thread between the rural women and the urban women is that the culture is as hard on the rural women as it is on the urban women. It is just a level of resistance that is different. The urban women have more resistance or kind of more rebellion towards certain culture that will put the women down than the women in the rural areas.
Thank you so much, Hawa. And I think that's the cultural aspect that you have raised is really peculiar and important. So now I'd like to bring Sasha. You have shared with us like a detailed like rundown of the context, but also the timelines of what is being achieved. So 2 questions for you, Sasha, if you could ask them, we could respond to them together. One, if you could speak, because like often than not, folks will see us as women's rights organization, feminists engaging in the policy processes or going to CCSW or UNEA. I'm sure some of you are in Nairobi right now. So if you could speak on the role of policies and legislative process in advancing women's rights, but also importantly, as you have engaged in the global processes and you've seen in your presentation, you've sort of like showed a bit of what conversation that you were sharing with Romania. Like what, for example, what Nigeria could learn from other countries and from the global processes to really advance gender equality and specifically address poverty issues. To you, Sasha.
Thank you, Mishi, and thank you, Hawa. I think Hawa really addressed already some of the key points. And I think the last one on social measures and also the good example of the cash payments and the support for women farmers and women SMEs. These are the type of policies which have shown to be really strong and important for gender equality, because women have been the buffer zone for each economic crisis. Women have done all the unpaid care work. Every time we have a disaster, women are the ones cleaning up. Women are the ones doing day and night shifts, 24 hours a day almost, making sure that the ill family members are looked after, that the food is on the table, that the water is fetched, etc., etc. And of course, that makes that women's empowerment is almost impossible in these conditions. There is so much unpaid and hidden hours of free contribution to our societies by women. So we need to understand that this unpaid care work needs to be valued and needs to be shared with male family members, but also with the state. And there, come the social protection measures, which are so important for women's empowerment. We need women who are often working in informal sectors to have the same social protection as men who are working in companies. Companies will often provide them with paid sick leave, with pensions, but women need the same, and they need it either in an informal or in a formal job. We need women to have access to childcare, preschool childcare. We need them to have access to unemployment benefits or to sick leave. We need them also to have access to pensions. They have done all this work for free, and then at the end of their life, they are beggars on the streets. So this is such a great gender injustice. So I think that is where all countries need to start and strengthen their social protection measures. Unfortunately, many of our global financial institutions like the IMF have been pushing countries not to do this. They have been pushing for austerity measures. And this has been very, very detrimental to women's rights. So this has been one of the big fights of women's rights organizations to go against this. But I also wanted to highlight some other areas. I think indeed what was also mentioned by Hava is that we have often allocated a lot of funding to men in male sectors. And we have less invested in sectors where we have many women working. 70 or 80% of people working in the health sector or in education are women, and often they're under budgeted. So there's another area where we should look at our budgets and where we should really make sure that we understand how this impacts on women's rights and empowerment in our countries. And I find it interesting that some of the main donors, like the EU, which provides 50% of ODA, that they have set targets that 85% of all their funding should be gender responsive. It should not have a negative gender equality impact. And some countries like Sweden have said it should be 100% of all their funding should not have a negative gender equality impact. So this is part of their gender action plans for their funding. So the EU's Department for International Partnerships has this gender action plan with this specific target of 85%. But we also see that more and more funders have feminist foreign policies, and that they are also seeing the importance of the role of organizations like ours, women's rights organizations. And they have been trying to get also more support for women's rights and feminist organizations. For example, the Netherlands through the SDG 5 fund, but also Canada, France, Spain, and many private foundations. So there also I see progress. And I see also progress in gender equality institutions. Not only at the national level, because there's amazing work which Nigeria has done, and that you really have, these gender focal points also for your climate policies, etc. But I see it also in the private sector. And when we came here to Nairobi to make a documentary movie for the UN, we found, for example, that some of the flower farms where there had been a lot of abuse, sexual abuse of female workers. Yeah, for example, they would need a day off because their child would be ill. Then some of the male managers would ask for sexual favors. Now, that type of very, difficult situations are now being addressed by some of these companies which are now engaging with, for example, social worker watches, organizations, NGOs, who train managers on gender equality. And they train all the staff. These are hundreds of people working in these flower farms. And they specifically enforce policies against sexual and gender-based violence in their companies. And I found that super inspiring to see how this is working out and strengthening women's rights in the labor market. Because we do see still, as one of the main barriers, sexual and gender-based violence in public spaces, in the workplace, but even in some schools and universities. And I think that is one of the big barriers we now still need to address, not only in Africa. I mean, in my first job, I suffered from sexual harassment and abuse. So this is a global issue. The Me Too movement has brought it to the forefront, and there we still need to do a lot of work. Yeah, so back to you, moderator.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I think you have really gave us like the two of you have worked sort of like perfectly how are giving us what the success and what has been achieved so far, and you like really highlighting what still needs to be done. And I think we have sort of like a comprehensive outlook of what we have achieved and what needs to be done. We were supposed to have a quick question Q&A, but mindful we have 2 minutes left. So I just want to ask if folks can expand like 1 minute, if there's anyone who have a specific critical question, if you're feeling that if I want to ask this question, then my day will be ruined. Just one question in the count of 1, 2, 3. All right. So there's no any urgent question. So with that, allow me now to give you, Sasha, because you're on my screen, you are cutting short. If there's one thing that everyone, like 60 of us who are in this call, need to do to advance gender equality, what will that be, that one thing? And then now I'll come to you after Sasha. Just one thing that, what's the ask? What are we asking the 60 people in this call to do to advance gender equality and reduce poverty?
I think we need to engage with our sisters, our strong women's rights sister organizations and movements. And I was very impressed here in Nairobi. We had the big demonstrations in the streets these last weeks against femicides. I mean, these are the type of movements we need to support. We need to work with movements and organizations like WEP, who are leaders on women and sustainable development in our regions. And I think that really makes a big difference and that we can all do. So join us in our movements.
Thank you, Sasha. Join us and connect with others as well. Hawa, what is one thing that you want everyone to do to advance gender equality?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. Sorry, I'm using something so that the point is a point. Okay. So I think for me, the most important thing, women economic empowerment. You see, poverty is evil. It creates a lot of problems, a multiplicity of problems where there
How
is
it
one.
seems like your audio, you seems to be muted. I don't know
Can you
if
hear
you're
me?
using.
Can you hear
Now,
me?
yeah, now it's better.
Okay, fine. So for me, I think the most important thing is economic empowerment. There's a lot that economic empowerment does to a person as a human. It increases your self-esteem. It helps with your courage. It helps with your dignity as a person, and more importantly, as a woman. And with economic empowerment, it reduces your enslavement to even patriarchal ideology. It reduces your enslavement to cultural, norms that seem to, tie women down. Oftentimes, what stops women, from moving further from an age is the fact that they are dependent on somebody or they do not have their own means to take care of their own most important basic. So for me, I think economic empowerment at all times will definitely break the chain of gender inequality and women's enslavement across all sectors. And following from that is the fact that I think it's important that the concept of he for she should be popularized and should be deepened. Because gender inequality is about men and women. And if the other part, the other half, of course, it affects women more than it affects men. But if the other part, or the other half of the population that is holding onto the authority, of gender oppression is not also sufficiently educated and mentally empowered to understand where gender inequality takes us, or does not take us in the developmental, process, then we will be doing just 50% of it. But where the women are also trained to know, to understand, and to appreciate women as partners in the development process, I think that fight or the process or the journey to gender equality becomes faster. Thank you.
Thank you so much, my panelists. Thank you, Hawa. A lot has been said in this short discussion of 20 minutes. We really deep dived on the successes and some of those that has cited, I think, worth noting is the visibility of the gender issue. We came now, at least in the space, whether you identify as feminist or not, as I said, people recognize that the gender equality is an important aspect of the development, but also is a justice issue. So we have achieved to create that visibility. So now the next step is, what are we doing with that visibility? It has been affirmed that thank you on their behalf. I don't know if they are here, and Priscilla. All right. I believe the recording of this session will be shared. For those who have joined and registered, the web team will be in contact with you for more session that will be coming. And again, thank you for giving us 1 hour and almost 6 minutes of your time today to have this conversation with us. Looking forward to continue our engagement and stand in solidarity with each other. So with that, I wish to thank you, everyone, and have a good day, everybody.
Thank you, Mishi. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Head of State
Thank you.
has called on ECOWAS Authority of Heads of
Really
State
informative. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Quite an interesting program.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. I had fun. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
I had fun too.
Thank you.
I had fun too. I just wish women will be more supportive to one another.
Thank you.
God bless you. Thank you. Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for very much.